In this section of the course, we're going to return to the approaches. There are two further approaches that you need to know beyond what you learn for your AS. Before we get onto those, just a quick recap by what we mean by approach, and that is a way of explaining behaviour. So each approach has a key concept, and it uses this key concept to explain why people behave in the way that they do. So these were the ones that you were introduced to for the AS course: behaviourist approach, biological approach, and the cognitive approach. The two new ones that you need to know are the psychodynamic approach, which is based around childhood and the unconscious, and the humanist approach, which doesn't have one factor to explain behaviour because it takes a holistic approach to explaining behaviour. It says that bits of everything can have an impact. So the one we're going to focus on today is the psychodynamic approach. Now, Freud's theories are based on two things. First of all, the idea of the unconscious mind, and the second one is the idea that childhood has a major impact on adult behaviour. Now, in order to understand how the unconscious mind can affect behaviour, you have to understand the structure of the personality. And in order to understand how childhood can affect behaviour, you need to understand how the personality actually develops. So we're going to take the unconscious mind first and talk through the structure of the personality. So this is quite a familiar or quite a common way to represent Freud's idea of the personality, and that's the idea of the iceberg, where only a small proportion of it is above the water and the rest of it the majority of it is below the water. And that waterline is the difference between things that we're conscious about and things that we're not conscious about. So he separated the personality into three different areas, and they're labelled here. It's the id, the ego, and the super-ego. Now, the id is very primitive. So it contains within it two drives: thanatos, which is the drive to die, the aggressive drive. It has all of our negative energy in it. And eros, which is the drive to live. So it has all of our positive energies in it, things like the libido. Now, the id is entirely unconscious. So all of these drives and desires that we have, we are not aware of, or not consciously aware of. Now, the other side of that, to balance that, Freud suggested the idea of the superego. And the superego is basically our moral conscience. It tells us what we should be doing, what's right to do. And although most of it's unconscious, there are parts of it that we are aware of. Parts of it do creep into our conscious mind. The third part, which is mostly conscious, is our ego. And this is the decision maker. The ego is the person in the middle who needs to balance the pull of the id against the responsibility of the superego in order to make decisions. This is a concept which has become very popular in pop culture. You've got the image of the id as the devil on one shoulder, and the superego is the angel on the other shoulder. And then the ego is our conscious awareness, the person who has to try and make a decision between what those two different forces are telling you to do. So what does all of this have to do with behaviour? Well, the ego experiences anxiety. If you think about how Homer was looking in that previous photo, he looked quite anxious, quite sad, and the ego has mechanisms called ego defense mechanisms, which it uses in order to reduce anxiety. And Freud suggested there were lots of different defense mechanisms. We're going to look at three of them, but the idea is with each of these mechanisms, they will change your behaviour in some way. So the three we're going to look at are repression, denial, and displacement. So repression, this might be something you've heard of before, is when you push something down into your unconscious so you can no longer remember it. Okay, so it goes out of your conscious mind, you're no longer aware of it. So it's probably going to be something traumatic or something which is undesirable, something that's not socially acceptable. But once we've pushed it into our unconscious, it can still have an effect on our behaviour. So even though we can't consciously remember a memory, it still can influence the way we behave. Denial, again, and it's another word that's come into sort of popular language if somebody's in denial, and it means that that person is refusing to accept that something is a problem. Now, the way this can affect our behaviour is it can lead to an unrealistic grasp on reality. So instead of maybe dealing with problems, a person might be behaving in a way which is inappropriate in that particular situation. The last one we're going to think about is displacement, and this is when somebody is showing strong emotions about something, but they're almost taking that emotion out on something other than the object which has caused the emotion or caused the anxiety. So this could be maybe you have a bad day at school or a bad day at work and you go home and you take it out on your parents, not because they've done anything which has caused you anxiety, but because you can't necessarily take out that anger or take out those emotions on the thing which has actually caused it. So in each of these ways, these ego defense mechanisms can have an effect on how we behave. So the second big factor of Freud's theory is the idea that childhood can have a really big impact on our behaviour. And to understand that, you need to understand how Freud suggested the personality developed. And he suggested that there were psychosexual stages which explained how the personality, the id, the ego and the superego developed. And this was over the first few years of a child's life. So the first stage is called the oral stage, and it's up to about a year old. And he said that at this age, children were dominated by the id. So there was no superego to modify their behaviour in any way. And a child's focus, or they gained pleasure from their mouth. So things like thumb sucking. The second stage lasted up from about 1 to 3 years old, and Freud termed this the anal stage. So at this point, the ego starts to develop, and pleasure moves from the mouth, which it was in the oral stage, to holding on to or expelling waste. So we're looking at around the time when potty training usually occurs. The third stage is the phallic stage, which lasted from about 3 to 6 years old. And it's only at this point that the superego actually starts to emerge. So at this age, Freud said that children derived pleasure from the genitalia. Between about 6 and 12 years old, Freud suggested that there was a pause in personality development, so nothing really happens at this point, and this is called latency. And he thought that this was because during that age there's a lot of physical and cognitive development, so the personality sort of paused in order to make room for those. But personality development continued after puberty, in the genital stage, where the focus again returned to the genitals. So again, what has all of this got to do with behaviour? And Freud's idea was that at each of these stages, children experienced a conflict around that bodily area that the stage was focused on. And if a child had too much gratification, so they got too much pleasure from that body part, or too little gratification, then that would mean the conflict would be unresolved. And it's this unresolved conflict that would have the effect on the adult personality. So we'll have a look at an example. If we take the oral stage, so this is a child in the oral stage. Let's imagine that either they're having too much gratification, so that could be they're sucking the dummy all the time, maybe it's never taken away from them, or too little gratification, so maybe they're never allowed to suck a dummy. Freud said both of these things would lead to someone growing up into being maybe suspicious and argumentative, and they might have behavioural traits such as smoking or comfort eating. And Freud termed this an oral personality. There are personalities associated with each of the stages. So an anal personality, that's an unresolved conflict at the anal stage, Freud said would result in an adult who was either obsessively clean or very messy. And an unresolved conflict at the phallic stage, Freud said, would result in an adult who was either frigid or very promiscuous. Now, the genital stage, provided there has been no unresolved conflict at any of the other stages, the genital stage leads to mature and satisfying sexual relationships. So in this way, whether or not that conflict is resolved in childhood would influence your behaviour as an adult. So before you come into the lesson, you need to make sure that you can explain what's meant by the unconscious, the pre-conscious and the conscious mind. Explain the id, the ego and the superego and what their roles are in terms of a person's personality. Explain what's meant by an ego defense mechanism and give examples of each, including how they can influence behaviour. Describe the psychosexual stages of development, and finally explain how conflict at each of those stages can lead to certain behaviours in adulthood. You can go back to the pre-reading and read about any of these in more depth, or you can go through and watch this video as many times as you like to help you.